In maritime accounts that trace the dense shipping corridors of Southeast Asia, the Strait of Malacca stands as one of the most active and tightly constrained sea passages in the world, where cargo vessels, regional traders, and international routes converge under constantly shifting environmental conditions. It is within this heavily trafficked stretch of water that the SS Ourang is said to have been operating during its final voyage, moving through a region shaped by monsoon-driven weather systems, layered communication traffic, and navigational demands that leave little margin for uncertainty once a vessel enters open transit. What follows is a reconstruction of events built from fragmented radio references, incomplete maritime logs, and disputed transmission records that continue to circulate in historical archives without full resolution. You are taken through the reported final communications, the surrounding environmental conditions, and the sequence of operational responses that followed the loss of contact, where each layer of evidence adds detail without fully closing the gaps it reveals. A cargo vessel with an uneasy reputation. In maritime records that stretch across the early 20th century, there are vessels whose histories appear straightforward only at first glance, before the details begin to thin out the further one searches into archives that were never fully preserved or consistently maintained. The SS Ourang is often placed among these uncertain entries, referenced in fragmented accounts that describe a cargo vessel operating in Southeast Asian waters during a period when shipping routes through the Strait of Malacca were already dense with wartime aftermath traffic and commercial recovery. What makes its name persist is not a continuous documented service record, but the way it appears in isolated references that seem to resist full verification, as though the ship existed clearly in motion but only partially in record. Even its early reputation is shaped less by official logs and more by later retellings that attempt to anchor it within known maritime structures, yet repeatedly encounter gaps that refuse to close. Some accounts describe the SS Ourang as a Dutch-flagged merchant vessel operating in the Dutch East Indies maritime network, a region where colonial shipping infrastructure was extensive but unevenly documented during transitional periods of control and reconstruction. In these descriptions, it is positioned among cargo carriers transporting general freight between island ports, following established commercial corridors that linked Sumatra, Java, and Singapore through heavily travelled sea lanes. However, when cross-referenced with surviving registry data from the era, no universally confirmed entry for the vessel appears in a way that definitively aligns with its later notoriety. This absence does not necessarily imply non-existence, but rather places the ship in a category of uncertain identification, where oral accounts, secondary references, and maritime recollections carry more weight than preserved documentation. Maritime registry systems during the early 20th century were not centralized across global shipping authorities, meaning that vessel documentation often existed in parallel national archives that did not always reconcile consistently with one another, particularly in regions where colonial administrative transitions were still in progress. Ships operating under commercial contracts could be registered under one authority, while simultaneously appearing in secondary records under alternative classifications, depending on charter arrangements, ownership transfers, or temporary operational leases. This system created a documentation environment in which a vessel's recorded identity could vary depending on which registry was consulted, without necessarily indicating procedural error. In such conditions, absence of a unified entry does not automatically imply absence of operation, but rather reflects the fragmented structure of maritime governance during periods of economic and political transition. The uncertainty becomes more pronounced when examining the inconsistencies surrounding ownership and registration details attributed to the vessel across different sources. In some narratives, the ship is said to have been managed under Dutch commercial authority, while in others it is loosely associated with regional trading companies operating under shifting post-war maritime governance structures. These contradictions are not unusual in historical shipping records from the period, where vessels were frequently repurposed, renamed, or re-registered as economic conditions changed rapidly after global conflict disrupted established trade systems. Yet in the case of the SS Ourang, the inconsistencies do not converge toward a single clarified identity, but instead branch into parallel descriptions that never fully resolve into a unified maritime profile. Even more unusual is the way the ship's physical characteristics are described in later retellings, which often reference it as a medium-sized cargo steamer capable of navigating both open sea routes and narrow coastal channels common in the Indonesian archipelago. These descriptions align broadly with typical merchant vessels of the era, which were often built for versatility rather than specialization, allowing them to move between island ports and larger international harbors without significant structural modification. However, without confirmed shipyard records or construction documentation, the exact origin of the SS Ourang remains indistinct, and attempts to trace its build history lead back into the same pattern of incomplete references that define much of its recorded existence. Cargo vessels operating in Southeast Asian waters during this period typically functioned within flexible trade networks, where freight assignments were often determined by fluctuating demand rather than fixed long-term scheduling, resulting in vessels carrying mixed cargo types across multiple ports without consistent standardization of declared manifests. This operational flexibility allowed shipping companies to maximize efficiency in rapidly changing post-war markets, but it also introduced variability in how cargo information was recorded across different ports of entry and exit. In many cases, cargo documentation was completed separately at each loading or unloading point, meaning that no single consolidated record always existed for an entire voyage. As a result, reconstructing a vessel's operational profile often requires synthesizing multiple partial manifests that may not fully align in classification, terminology, or reporting structure. What sustains interest in its early service history is not a clear timeline of voyages, but rather the suggestion that it operated within one of the most complex maritime environments in the world, where shipping density, weather unpredictability, and geopolitical transition often intersected in ways that made precise record-keeping difficult. The Strait of Malacca, in particular, has long been recognized as a critical maritime passage linking the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, and during the mid-20th century, it carried a mix of commercial cargo ships, military vessels, and regional traders whose movements were not always consistently logged across jurisdictions. Within this environment, a vessel like the SS Ourang could theoretically pass through numerous ports and channels, while leaving behind only partial traces in official documentation systems that were still adapting to post-war administrative structures. It is within this context of fragmented maritime recording that later inconsistencies surrounding the ship begin to gain significance, not because they confirm any extraordinary claim, but because they highlight how easily a vessel's identity could become obscured even in heavily trafficked waters. Reports that mention the SS Ourang often emerge decades after the period it is said to have operated, relying on recollections, secondary citations, or reinterpretations of earlier maritime incident compilations. These sources do not always agree on basic details such as port of origin, cargo type, or even the precise spelling of the ship's name, which itself appears in multiple variations across different accounts. Each variation adds another layer of uncertainty, making it increasingly difficult to determine where documented history ends and reconstructed narrative begins. Variations in ship naming conventions were also common in maritime documentation systems, where transliteration practices, regional language differences, and clerical recording standards could influence how a vessel's name was entered into official records. In multilingual shipping environments, particularly those involving Dutch, English, and regional administrative authorities, minor discrepancies in spelling or phonetic transcription were not unusual and could persist across multiple archival entries without correction. These variations did not necessarily indicate separate vessels, but they could create long-term ambiguity when later researchers attempted to reconcile fragmented records into a single cohesive identity. Over time, repeated exposure to inconsistent naming forms can produce a layered archival footprint in which a vessel appears under multiple identifiers, each partially correct within its own documentation context, but collectively contributing to uncertainty when viewed retrospectively. At the same time, the ship's association with later unexplained maritime distress narratives has contributed to a gradual reshaping of its early history, as retrospective interpretations often project the weight of its alleged final transmission backward onto its origins. This is a common pattern in maritime mystery cases, where the absence of definitive data invites reinterpretation of earlier periods through the lens of later events. In the case of the SS Ourang, this has resulted in its construction and early service history being repeatedly revisited not for what is confirmed, but for what is missing, with each gap in documentation becoming a point of renewed speculation rather than closure. Yet despite the speculative nature of these associations, certain consistent elements remain in how the vessel is described across disparate accounts, particularly its function as a cargo transporter operating within Southeast Asian trade routes during a period of intense maritime activity. Cargo ships of this type were essential to regional economies, carrying raw materials, manufactured goods, and provisions between rapidly developing ports that were still rebuilding infrastructure disrupted by war and colonial transition. Within such a system, individual vessels often blended into larger patterns of movement that prioritized function over long-term archival precision, allowing many ships to pass through history with only partial documentation preserved in scattered registries and shipping reports. Navigation through the Strait of Malacca during this era required constant adaptation to environmental variability, as shifting currents, seasonal weather systems, and dense vessel traffic created conditions in which precise route tracking was often secondary to immediate navigational safety. Ships operating in these waters relied heavily on manual charting and visual confirmation methods that could be affected by reduced visibility, sudden weather changes, or intermittent communication delays between coastal stations. In such environments, even well-documented voyages could experience gaps in positional recording, particularly during night passages or periods of heavy traffic congestion. These conditions contributed to a maritime landscape where movement was continuous, but documentation could become intermittently discontinuous, leaving portions of a vessel's journey recorded only through inferred positioning rather than direct observational logs. The SS Ourang, as it appears within this fragmented historical framework, becomes less a singular, clearly defined vessel and more a convergence point for incomplete records, shifting narratives, and maritime recollections that never fully align. Its early service history is therefore shaped not only by what is written, but equally by what is absent, with each missing detail contributing to the broader uncertainty that surrounds its identity. This uncertainty does not immediately suggest an anomaly, but it does create the conditions in which later interpretations can expand, particularly when combined with reports of its final voyage that would eventually overshadow any trace of its earlier operations. And somewhere beyond those fractured records, the vessel was already moving toward waters where its silence would become its defining trace. Departure into the Strait of Malacca. Silence. Carrying forward through fragmented maritime references, the SS Ourang is no longer positioned within uncertain archives, but instead appears to drift outward into a corridor where recorded identity gives way to active movement across open sea routes, where what was once reconstructed from inconsistent documentation begins to take the shape of a vessel entering a defined geographic space, governed not by history alone but by the operational realities of navigation in one of the busiest maritime passages in the world. In this transition from static record to motion, the focus shifts away from what the ship was said to be and toward what it would have encountered as it aligned itself with the established commercial pathways connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, a route that has long required precise coordination due to its narrow geography and persistent traffic density. Stretching between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, the Strait of Malacca compresses global maritime traffic into a narrow passage where commercial vessels, coastal currents, and shifting weather systems intersect with constant operational intensity, forming a navigational environment where timing, positioning, and environmental awareness become essential for safe passage through waters that are both economically vital and physically constrained. Within this corridor, ships of varying sizes and origins move in continuous succession, creating a layered flow of maritime activity that requires coordination across regional authorities, port stations, and vessel operators who rely on structured communication protocols to maintain order in an environment that is constantly in motion. Even in periods of routine transit, the density of traffic alone introduces a level of complexity that demands sustained attention from navigation crews, particularly when visibility conditions or sea states begin to shift without extended warning. Maritime routing through the Strait of Malacca during this period was organised around established separation schemes that guided vessel movement through defined traffic lanes designed to reduce collision risk in high-density shipping environments. These routing structures were not physically marked in the ocean, but were instead maintained through navigational charts, coastal guidance systems, and adherence to internationally recognised shipping protocols that instructed vessels on directional flow depending on inbound or outbound movement. Ships entering the corridor were expected to align their course with these generalised traffic patterns, while continuously adjusting for local conditions and surrounding vessel activity. However, because enforcement relied primarily on coordination rather than physical barriers, adherence depended heavily on navigational discipline and situational awareness maintained by each vessel's crew. Within this framework, movement through the strait was structured yet flexible, allowing ships to integrate into a shared navigational system without direct central control. Position reports associated with vessels entering this corridor during the period were typically transmitted in intermittent intervals, creating a navigation pattern that relied as much on coastal observation points as on direct ship-to-shore communication, especially in regions where signal reception could vary depending on atmospheric conditions and geographic obstruction caused by surrounding land masses and passing vessels. These reports formed a fragmented but functional system of tracking, where ships were not continuously monitored in real time as understood in modern satellite navigation, but instead recorded through periodic confirmations of location that allowed maritime authorities to maintain a general awareness of movement across key shipping lanes. In such a system, continuity was implied rather than directly observed, and gaps between transmissions were not necessarily unusual, though they required interpretation within a broader navigational context to ensure safe passage through congested waters. Communication intervals between vessels and coastal monitoring stations were not continuous, but scheduled according to operational requirements, meaning that position updates were often transmitted at designated checkpoints, rather than in real-time tracking sequences. These reporting intervals could vary depending on vessel type, route complexity, and regional communication requirements, resulting in structured but non-uniform data flow across maritime networks. In heavily trafficked regions such as Southeast Asian shipping corridors, this system allowed authorities to maintain functional awareness of vessel movement without requiring constant transmission, reducing radio congestion while preserving navigational oversight. However, the inherent limitation of this approach was that any gap between reporting points represented a period during which a vessel's precise location remained unverified, relying instead on projected movement estimates based on last known coordinates and expected travel speed. When combined with environmental variability, these gaps introduced natural uncertainty into real-time positional tracking without necessarily indicating any operational irregularity. Monsoon-influenced weather systems moving across Southeast Asia frequently altered visibility and sea conditions without warning, forcing even well-established trade routes to adapt continuously to rapidly changing environmental constraints that could affect both surface navigation and radio communication reliability. Rainfall intensity, wind shifts, and localized storm activity could reduce visibility to near minimal levels in certain stretches of the strait, while also impacting sea surface behavior in ways that required immediate adjustment in course and speed. These conditions were not exceptional within the region's climatic patterns, but their timing and variability often meant that vessels moving through the corridor had to respond dynamically rather than rely on stable forecasts alone. As a result, navigation through this passage was as much an exercise in real-time environmental interpretation as it was in adherence to predefined maritime routes. As the vessel advanced deeper into the Strait of Malacca, the structured consistency of maritime reporting began to narrow, with fewer confirmed positional markers appearing across standard communication channels used in regional navigation, not as an immediate indication of disruption but as a reflection of how reporting intervals could naturally extend depending on traffic density, signal conditions, and operational priorities assigned to vessels moving through high-volume sea lanes. Within such environments, the absence of frequent updates does not inherently signal irregularity, yet it introduces a gradual thinning of external visibility over a ship's precise location, especially when combined with environmental factors that limit observation from coastal stations or passing vessels. In this gradual reduction of external reference points, the vessel remains physically present within the corridor, while becoming increasingly less distinct within the shared system of recorded movement. At the same time, the surrounding maritime environment maintains its constant activity, with commercial traffic continuing to flow through established channels, guided by long-standing routing conventions that prioritize separation, efficiency, and collision avoidance in one of the most heavily utilized waterways on the planet. The strait functions not as a static passage, but as a continuously shifting network of coordinated movement, where ships adjust their positioning in response to both environmental conditions and the presence of other vessels, creating a layered dynamic that persists regardless of any single ship's individual trajectory. Within this broader system, each vessel represents both an independent route and a component of collective maritime flow, contributing to an interconnected structure that depends on uninterrupted communication and spatial awareness. Voyage direction aboard cargo vessels during this era relied primarily on visual observation, compass-based adjustments, and periodic reference to coastal landmarks when available, with radio communication serving as a supplementary rather than primary guidance tool in many operational contexts. Bridge officers were responsible for continuously interpreting environmental conditions such as wave patterns, wind shifts, and surrounding vessel movement, adjusting course incrementally to maintain alignment with both safety protocols and intended routing objectives. In congested waterways, these decisions had to be made rapidly and often without full situational clarity, particularly when multiple vessels were operating in close proximity under variable visibility conditions. The effectiveness of navigation therefore depended not only on external communication systems, but also on the immediate judgment of crew members interpreting constantly changing environmental inputs. This human decision layer ensured operational flexibility, but also introduced variability in how identical conditions could be navigated by different vessels moving through the same corridor. As the SS Ourang progresses through this environment, the narrative of its movement becomes less about isolated action and more about its integration into a dense and operationally demanding corridor, where the distinction between individual voyage and collective traffic pattern begins to blur under conditions of continuous motion and environmental variability. The ship is no longer only a subject of fragmented historical reconstruction, but an active participant in a region defined by constant maritime negotiation, where every positional adjustment reflects both external conditions and internal operational decisions made in response to the immediate demands of navigation. In this space, even routine movement carries an underlying complexity shaped by geography, climate, and the structural limitations of mid-century maritime communication systems. Further into the passage, the interplay between predictable shipping routes and unpredictable environmental shifts becomes increasingly significant, as vessels are required to maintain course stability while simultaneously adapting to localized changes in weather and sea state that may not be uniformly experienced across the entire strait. This creates a condition where two ships traveling the same general route may encounter entirely different navigational realities within short distances of each other, depending on timing, position, and atmospheric variation. Such disparities contribute to the inherent variability of maritime transit in the region, reinforcing the need for continuous situational awareness even when overall conditions appear stable from a broader perspective. Environmental conditions within the Strait of Malacca did not operate as a single uniform system, but rather as a series of overlapping microenvironments shaped by coastal geography, seasonal atmospheric shifts, and localized weather activity that could differ significantly across short distances. One section of the strait could experience clear visibility, while another, only several nautical miles away, might be affected by rainfall or reduced sight lines caused by humidity and atmospheric compression. These variations created a navigational landscape in which environmental stability could not be assumed across broader spatial ranges, requiring vessels to continuously reassess conditions as they moved through different segments of the corridor. Such variability influenced not only visual navigation, but also the reliability of signal transmission, as atmospheric density changes could affect radio wave propagation in ways that altered reception clarity between ships and coastal stations. In this layered environment, movement through the strait was shaped by constantly shifting conditions that resisted uniform prediction. As the vessel continues forward, the accumulation of these environmental and operational factors begins to subtly redefine the nature of its recorded presence, not through abrupt change but through a gradual narrowing of externally verified detail, where each successive point of reference contributes slightly less clarity than the one before it. This is not an anomaly in itself, but rather a reflection of how maritime systems of the time functioned under conditions of density, distance, and intermittent communication, where full continuity of tracking was not always achievable across extended stretches of open navigation. Beyond the last routine signals transmitted along the corridor, the record of the voyage begins to fracture into silence that no single station would later fully confirm. The first distress signals no one could verify. Lingering beyond the last recorded silence of the Strait of Malacca passage, irregular bursts of radio activity begin to surface within fragmented maritime monitoring channels, though none of them initially form a coherent or confirmed distress sequence. And what makes these traces particularly difficult to interpret is not their presence alone, but the way they appear intermittently across records that were never designed to preserve continuous real-time communication with precision. In maritime systems of the period, signals could be captured in partial form depending on atmospheric conditions, receiver sensitivity, and geographic positioning of coastal stations, meaning that what survives in archival summaries is often not the full transmission itself, but a reconstructed impression based on incomplete reception logs and operator notes recorded under varying conditions of clarity. The result is a record that suggests communication occurred without preserving communication itself in full continuity. Operating across high-frequency maritime bands widely used during mid-century navigation, ship-to-shore transmissions were highly susceptible to atmospheric interference, signal scattering, and reception degradation over long distances, particularly in equatorial regions where ionospheric variation and monsoon-driven weather patterns could significantly alter transmission stability without warning. These communication channels were essential for maintaining coordination between vessels and coastal authorities, yet they operated within a technological framework that did not guarantee uniform clarity, especially when multiple ships were transmitting within the same general corridor. Under such conditions, even routine messages could become partially distorted, requiring interpretation by trained radio operators who often had to distinguish between meaningful communication, background interference, and overlapping transmissions originating from different sources. In this environment, clarity was never guaranteed. It was reconstructed in real time. Recorded accounts of distress communications in maritime history frequently show inconsistencies in timing and phrasing when reconstructed from secondary logs, particularly when multiple reception points capture only partial segments of a transmission, leading to variations in how the same signal is documented across different stations that may not have received identical portions of the original broadcast. In some cases, a signal that appears clear at one location may register only as fragmented noise at another, resulting in discrepancies that only become apparent during later compilation of reports. This is especially relevant in heavily trafficked maritime corridors, where overlapping transmissions from multiple vessels can further complicate signal isolation, making it difficult to determine whether separate recordings represent the same communication event or entirely distinct transmissions occurring within a short temporal window. The uncertainty is not only technical, it is structural, built into the system itself. Across overlapping coastal monitoring records, references to anomalous or unclear transmissions often diverge in detail, with reported timestamps, signal strength descriptions, and interpretive notes failing to align into a unified sequence of events, creating a situation where the existence of a transmission may be acknowledged in principle without its content being consistently preserved in any single authoritative record. In maritime communication archives, this type of divergence is not uncommon, particularly in periods when analog recording methods relied heavily on manual logging rather than automated system synchronization. However, when multiple accounts reference a similar category of distress-like signal without agreement on its exact structure or origin, the result is a layered ambiguity that resists straightforward consolidation into a single verified narrative. What is preserved is not agreement, but repetition of uncertainty. In practice, coastal monitoring stations often operated with different reception sensitivities and calibration states, meaning that identical transmissions could produce significantly different acoustic interpretations depending on local equipment conditions at the exact moment of reception. Even minor variations in receiver tuning could alter how signal boundaries were perceived, especially when transmissions were partially obscured by atmospheric noise or overlapping frequency activity. This created a situation in which the same radio event could exist simultaneously as a clear signal in one archive and as fragmented noise in another, without either record being technically incorrect. When later consolidated, these differences did not cancel each other out, but instead accumulated into layered uncertainty across archival systems. Within standard maritime communication protocols, any unconfirmed distress signal is typically subject to verification procedures that require cross-referencing multiple independent reception sources before formal acknowledgement is issued, a process designed to prevent misclassification of routine interference or unrelated transmissions as genuine emergency calls. This verification structure depends on consistency across reception points, as well as the ability to correlate signal timing, directionality, and content clarity across different monitoring stations. When such alignment is absent, signals often remain classified as unverified or inconclusive, existing in a procedural space between detection and confirmation, where they are recorded but not fully acted upon as definitive distress events. In practical terms, this means that some signals can exist operationally without ever becoming formally real within response systems. Beyond formal verification rules, operators also worked under an unspoken interpretive constraint, where uncertain signals were often mentally stabilized before being logged, meaning that hesitation in audio clarity was subconsciously resolved into the closest recognizable communication pattern, based on training and repetition exposure. This cognitive stabilization process was not recorded in official procedures, yet it shaped how ambiguous transmissions entered the archival record, since the act of writing required the operator to select a definitive form even when perception itself remained uncertain. In high-load monitoring environments, this meant that uncertainty was not preserved as uncertainty, but converted into structured language that masked its original instability. Over extended shifts, this created a subtle compression effect in communication records, where variability in perception gradually disappeared behind standardized phrasing conventions. At the reception level, the act of distinguishing between noise and signal is itself dependent on trained auditory pattern recognition, where operators develop sensitivity to cadence shifts, tonal irregularities, and abrupt modulation changes that may indicate structured communication embedded within interference. However, this process is inherently vulnerable to misinterpretation, particularly when environmental noise mimics characteristics commonly associated with distress transmission patterns. In such cases, the boundary between signal and distortion becomes less defined, requiring operators to rely on probability rather than certainty when logging ambiguous transmissions. Over time, this introduces subtle variability into archived records, as different operators may classify similar acoustic inputs in slightly different ways depending on context and perception. As successive interpretations attempt to reconstruct the same fragmented transmission fragments, the absence of consistent structural alignment between recordings begins to erode the possibility of establishing a definitive origin or message continuity, leaving only a pattern of partial data points that suggest presence without stability. In such conditions, the process of reconstruction itself becomes increasingly interpretive, relying on incomplete overlaps between recordings that may never have captured the same segment of communication in full. What emerges is not a clear transmission, but a fluctuating outline shaped by gaps in reception, variations in recording methods, and the limitations of analog maritime communication systems operating under environmental stress. The signal persists only as a pattern of discontinuity. At the same time, the broader maritime environment continues to function without interruption, with vessels maintaining routine movement through established shipping lanes and communication networks processing standard traffic alongside any irregular signals that fail to meet verification thresholds. This contrast between operational continuity and informational instability reinforces the difficulty of isolating any single transmission as definitive, especially when the surrounding communication landscape remains active and densely populated with overlapping signals that do not inherently indicate distress. Within this environment, ambiguity is not unusual, but rather an expected byproduct of constant maritime activity combined with variable transmission conditions. The system continues functioning even when interpretation does not stabilize. Further complicating reconstruction efforts is the fact that reception quality in coastal monitoring stations can vary significantly depending on time of day, atmospheric conditions, and equipment calibration, meaning that identical transmissions may be recorded differently even within short time intervals. These variations do not necessarily indicate error, but they do introduce a level of inconsistency that becomes more pronounced when attempting to align multiple partial records into a single coherent sequence. Over time, such inconsistencies accumulate, creating a layered archive where interpretation depends heavily on comparison rather than direct confirmation. The archive becomes relational rather than absolute. In addition, the geographic distribution of reception points means that no single monitoring station can guarantee full coverage of a transmission event occurring within a dynamic maritime corridor, particularly in regions where atmospheric propagation can shift signal reach unpredictably across short distances. This creates a fragmented reception landscape in which different stations may record different portions of the same transmission, or in some cases, entirely different transmissions occurring within similar frequency ranges. When later compiled, these fragments must be interpreted as parts of a potential whole, even when there is no certainty that they belong to a single continuous message. Reconstruction becomes an act of alignment rather than verification. As the fragments associated with these reported signals are reviewed across different documentation sources, the absence of a unified waveform or consistently transcribed message becomes increasingly significant, not because it confirms a specific outcome, but because it prevents any single interpretation from achieving full stability within the historical record. This condition leaves the transmission suspended between detection and definition, present in multiple forms yet complete in none of them, existing as a communication event that resists final categorization. The absence of completion becomes its most consistent feature. What remains across the fragmented logs is not a complete transmission, but a sequence of uncertain fragments that appear to converge toward a message no authority could fully confirm. The final transmission. We are in hell. Residual traces preserved within unresolved radio logs begin to converge in retrospective analysis around a singular transmission fragment that appears repeatedly across secondary maritime communication summaries, not as a fully verified recording, but as a recurring point of reference that survives through partial transcription, interpretive reporting, and archival repetition. What makes this convergence notable is not that a complete message exists in any official sense, but that fragmented references across different documentation sources begin to align around the idea that something distinct was received during the SS Ourang's final communication window, even though no single continuous recording has ever been confirmed as definitive. In maritime communication history, such patterns are not entirely uncommon, especially in environments where reception conditions fluctuate and where multiple stations may record overlapping segments of the same signal without ever capturing its full structure. In this case, however, the persistence of a specific phrase across unrelated summaries creates a rare form of analytical tension, where repetition itself becomes the only consistent element in an otherwise unstable dataset. The record does not stabilize the message, it stabilizes its ambiguity. Standard maritime distress procedures during the mid-century period required structured transmission formats designed to ensure clarity, repetition, and immediate recognizability across international monitoring stations, with established conventions intended to reduce ambiguity during emergency communication. These protocols were built around the expectation that distress signals would follow recognizable patterns, often repeating key identifiers and structured phrases to ensure that even partially received transmissions could be interpreted correctly by listening stations. In theory, this system was designed to minimize misunderstanding, but in practice, it remained dependent on signal clarity, atmospheric stability, and the ability of receiving operators to distinguish meaningful communication from interference or overlapping transmissions occurring within the same frequency bands. Even under ideal conditions, high-frequency maritime radio could produce distortions that stretched or compressed segments of speech, meaning that transcription accuracy often relied heavily on operator experience rather than purely technical precision. The system assumed clarity as a baseline condition that rarely existed in full form. Within several reconstructed interpretations of the SS Ourang communication record, a brief and striking phrase is consistently cited, though its exact wording varies slightly across different archival summaries, appearing in some references as a short, declarative statement, and in others as a more fragmented transcription that reflects partial reception rather than full clarity. What remains consistent across these variations is not uniform phrasing, but the persistence of a core linguistic structure that stands apart from standard maritime distress conventions, making it a point of interest in later analyses that attempt to categorize unusual or irregular radio communications. However, none of these references originates from a single preserved audio source, and instead emerge from compilations of reported receptions, secondary notes, and retrospective reconstructions assembled long after the original event was said to have occurred. In some cases, the phrase is presented without contextual timing, while in others it is placed within a broader sequence of degraded transmission fragments, further complicating efforts to determine whether it represents a continuous message or an isolated, misinterpreted segment. The instability of sourcing becomes part of the signal itself. Attempts to trace the geographic and temporal origin of the reported transmission reveal inconsistencies between logged reception points, with no single monitoring station providing a complete synchronized record of the message, and with variations in reported timing that prevent full alignment across documented sources. In maritime communication systems of the period, it was common for different stations to receive partial or degraded versions of the same transmission depending on atmospheric conditions, equipment sensitivity, and signal propagation behavior across long distances. These factors could result in multiple interpretations of a single communication event, each shaped by the specific conditions under which the signal was received, recorded, and later transcribed into archival summaries. In regions such as the Strait of Malacca, where electromagnetic conditions could shift rapidly due to weather systems and coastal interference, even short transmissions could fragment into multiple interpretive readings depending on the position of the receiving station relative to atmospheric disturbances. Distance did not guarantee consistency. Sometimes it guaranteed divergence. From a procedural communication standpoint, distress messages transmitted through maritime radio systems typically adhere to standardized phrasing conventions intended to minimize ambiguity under emergency conditions, with structured repetition and recognizable terminology serving as safeguards against misinterpretation. This structure was particularly important in high-traffic maritime corridors, where multiple vessels and stations might be transmitting simultaneously, increasing the likelihood of overlapping signals or partial reception. In such environments, deviation from expected phrasing patterns can draw attention during later review, not necessarily as evidence of authenticity or anomaly, but as a feature that complicates classification within established communication frameworks. When a signal does not conform neatly to expected structure, it often requires additional layers of interpretive validation before it can be categorized as either routine communication, interference, or genuine distress transmission. Structure in this sense becomes a diagnostic tool rather than a guarantee of meaning. Even when a transmission fragment is widely referenced across multiple secondary sources, its classification remains dependent on whether it can be anchored to a verified reception chain, meaning that repetition alone does not elevate a signal into formal status within maritime communication records. This creates a distinction between documented reference and verified transmission, where the former may persist indefinitely in archival discourse without ever achieving the evidentiary stability required for full classification. In unresolved cases, this separation becomes critical, as it allows a signal to exist historically without ever becoming operationally confirmed, preserving ambiguity within the structure of the record itself. At the reception level, operators were trained to mentally normalize incoming audio patterns by compensating for static bursts, signal fading, and tonal distortion, effectively reconstructing probable speech patterns from incomplete auditory input before committing them to written log entries. This cognitive reconstruction process introduced a necessary but unavoidable interpretive layer between signal and record, where the operator's perception functioned as the first stage of archival transformation. In high interference conditions, this meant that a transmission could exist in multiple perceived forms even before it was formally recorded, depending on how different operators resolved ambiguous segments in real time. These microvariations rarely mattered for routine communications, but in distress scenarios they could accumulate into significant divergences when logs were later compared across stations. The human ear became an analog decoder operating without certainty of correctness. Across maritime communication archives, unverified or partially received distress signals are often held in provisional status pending cross-verification, leaving many transmissions without formal classification in finalized records, especially when supporting documentation is incomplete or inconsistent across reception points. This procedural caution is standard practice within maritime safety systems, as premature classification of ambiguous signals can lead to misdirected response efforts or incorrect attribution of distress events. As a result, many signals that are recorded in preliminary logs may never progress beyond tentative status, remaining in archival records as unresolved entries that acknowledge reception without confirming content or origin. Over time, such entries can accumulate interpretive weight, particularly when later researchers revisit them through the lens of new analytical frameworks or comparative case studies involving similar unresolved maritime communications. What begins as procedural caution gradually becomes archival permanence without resolution. As successive layers of documentation are reviewed, differences in transcription style, terminology choice, and signal classification begin to introduce subtle inconsistencies that further complicate alignment across archival systems, especially when comparing operator logs with centralized communication summaries compiled after the fact. These discrepancies are often small in isolation, but when aggregated across multiple entries, they create a fragmented interpretive field in which the same transmission event may appear differently depending on the source being examined. In some cases, even signal strength descriptors vary between records that ostensibly refer to the same reception event, suggesting either differences in reception quality or differences in how that quality was subjectively assessed by different operators. This introduces variability not only in content but in perceived reliability of the transmission itself. Over time, references to the disputed SS Ourang transmission have appeared in multiple retrospective maritime analyses, where its significance is often shaped more by interpretive repetition than by direct evidentiary confirmation, gradually transforming a fragmentary communication event into a widely discussed point of maritime mystery discourse. This process of reinterpretation is not uncommon in historical communication cases, where incomplete records become re-examined through successive layers of analysis, each adding new contextual framing without introducing new primary evidence. In this way, the transmission becomes less a fixed historical artifact and more a developing interpretive construct, shaped by how later sources choose to reference and describe it. Even within technical discussions, the phrase is often treated less as a verified data point and more as a reference marker for the broader problem of signal uncertainty in maritime distress interpretation. Meaning shifts from content to continuity of reference. What further deepens the ambiguity is the absence of any confirmed continuous audio reconstruction that could anchor the phrase within a stable communicative sequence, leaving all interpretations dependent on fragmented logs that vary in clarity and completeness. In several cases, the same supposed transmission is described with differences in intensity, duration, or signal quality, suggesting either multiple partial receptions of a single event or the conflation of similar but unrelated communication fragments occurring within a narrow temporal window. This ambiguity does not necessarily indicate fabrication or error, but it highlights the inherent limitations of analog maritime communication systems operating under conditions where environmental and technical variables constantly influence reception quality. The system preserves traces, not continuity. As archival comparison expands, the transmission begins to function less as a singular communicative event and more as a convergence point for multiple incomplete records that resist full reconciliation into a unified signal history. Each reference adds another partial contour without resolving the underlying structure, reinforcing the sense that what is being analysed is not a message in isolation, but a layered reconstruction assembled from multiple imperfect viewpoints. In this sense, the transmission exists less as something that was fully received and more as something that was partially reconstructed many times over, never stabilizing into a final form. Attention gradually moves away from the transmission itself and toward the radio operators who were left with accounts they could never fully reconcile. Radio operators who heard too much and said too little. Following the disputed interpretation of the final SS Ourang transmission, attention shifts away from the signal itself and toward the intermediary layer of maritime communication, where all received information must pass through human auditory judgment before entering official record systems, a stage in the communication process that is often overlooked in retrospective analysis, but is essential to understanding how raw radio input becomes documented history. Within mid-century maritime communication networks, radio operators stationed aboard ships and at coastal monitoring facilities were responsible for manually receiving, interpreting, and logging transmissions transmitted across high-frequency channels, working within systems that depended heavily on trained auditory recognition rather than automated decoding, since digital signal processing technology had not yet become standard in operational maritime environments. Their role was not simply to record information, but to distinguish meaningful communication from interference, distortion, and overlapping transmissions, often under conditions where clarity could shift within seconds due to atmospheric variation or signal congestion across active shipping corridors. In practice, this meant that the record of any given transmission was already an interpretation at the moment it was written down, shaped by human perception operating under time pressure and imperfect acoustic conditions. What is less frequently acknowledged in formal communication histories is that this interpretive step was not secondary to the transmission process but functioned as a necessary transformation layer, converting unstable acoustic input into structured written documentation that could be used by later coordination systems. Operators were trained to recognize tonal irregularities, interrupted cadence patterns, and frequency drift as potential indicators of urgency. Yet they were also instructed to avoid overclassification, particularly in environments where atmospheric interference could mimic distress-like patterns. This dual requirement, sensitivity without overreaction, created a narrow interpretive threshold that operators had to navigate continuously during active monitoring shifts. Over long durations of exposure, this threshold became less a fixed rule and more an adaptive judgment exercised in real time, shaped by accumulated experience and the immediate acoustic environment. Under conditions of atmospheric instability and overlapping frequency activity, operators frequently encountered partially degraded transmissions that required immediate auditory interpretation without the benefit of complete signal clarity, meaning that fragments of speech, tonal shifts, or interrupted phrases had to be mentally reconstructed in real time before being written into log entries that would later serve as the official reference for the transmission event. In regions such as Southeast Asian maritime corridors, where environmental conditions and vessel density frequently affected radio propagation, these challenges were not exceptional but routine, and operators were trained to maintain accuracy even when signals arrived in fragmented or inconsistent form. The Strait of Malacca in particular, as a heavily trafficked maritime passage, created conditions where multiple transmissions could overlap within narrow frequency windows, producing situations where signal separation depended not only on equipment, but also on the operator's ability to isolate meaningful audio patterns from layered interference. However, the process of interpretation itself introduced a structural dependency on human perception, where two operators exposed to the same signal could plausibly produce slightly different written records depending on momentary clarity, fatigue, or interference patterns present at the time of reception. Fatigue itself is a significant but often underrepresented variable in historical communication accuracy, as operators frequently worked extended shifts during periods of high maritime traffic, during which continuous monitoring of static heavy frequencies required sustained cognitive focus under low information conditions. In such environments, the human brain naturally begins to prioritize pattern recognition over full signal reconstruction, leading to subtle compression in how auditory input is converted into written summary. This compression does not necessarily indicate error, but it does introduce variability in how identical or near-identical transmissions are recorded across different stations. As a result, archival consistency becomes dependent not only on signal quality, but also on operator condition at the precise moment of reception, a factor that is rarely visible in formal records, but deeply embedded in their variability. In certain archived communication logs, entries corresponding to unclear or incomplete transmissions contain minimal descriptive annotation, reflecting a procedural limitation rather than a fully elaborated account of reception conditions, as operators often prioritized recording essential identifiers such as approximate time, frequency band, and general signal quality, rather than attempting to reconstruct uncertain phrasing that could not be confidently verified. This practice created a type of archival silence that does not necessarily indicate absence of information, but instead reflects the boundaries of what could be reliably documented under operational constraints. Over time, these minimal entries become significant not because of what they explicitly contain, but because of what they leave unresolved, particularly when later researchers attempt to correlate them with broader patterns of maritime communication anomalies. In some cases, these records are reduced to brief notations that indicate only the presence of distorted speech, or unreadable distress fragments, leaving entire communication events suspended in administrative ambiguity without descriptive continuity. What emerges from this archival pattern is a form of structured incompleteness, where the absence of detail is not accidental, but produced through standardized documentation practices designed to prioritize operational efficiency over narrative preservation. Communication logs were never intended to serve as complete historical reconstructions. Rather, they functioned as operational tools meant to support immediate decision-making and coordination. This distinction becomes critical when examining how later interpretations attempt to reconstruct meaning from entries that were never designed to carry interpretive depth. The transformation from operational log to historical artifact introduces a second layer of meaning that was not present at the time of recording, creating interpretive distance between original reception and later analysis. Standard maritime communication protocols required that any ambiguous or partially received distress signal undergo structured verification procedures before being formally escalated within naval or coastal reporting hierarchies, a safeguard designed to prevent misclassification of routine interference or unrelated transmissions as genuine emergency events. This verification process typically involved cross-referencing multiple reception points, assessing signal consistency, and confirming whether identifiable distress markers were present within the transmission structure. If sufficient alignment could not be established across independent sources, the signal would remain in an unconfirmed category, recorded but not fully activated within operational response frameworks. This procedural caution was essential in maintaining reliability within maritime safety systems, particularly in high-traffic regions where false positives could divert critical resources away from genuine emergencies. Yet this same caution also meant that some signals could persist in a state of unresolved ambiguity, acknowledged but never fully resolved into actionable certainty. At the procedural level, escalation was not a single decision, but a sequence of threshold crossings, each requiring validation from different components of the communication network before advancing to the next stage. This created a multi-layered decision architecture in which information moved through successive filters, each designed to reduce uncertainty, but also capable of halting progression entirely if confirmation criteria were not met. In practice, this meant that even signals perceived as unusual by initial operators could be paused indefinitely within intermediate evaluation states if supporting confirmation was insufficient. The system did not reject these signals outright. It simply prevented them from advancing further until additional corroboration could be obtained, which in many cases never occurred. Across multiple maritime archival systems, a consistent pattern emerges in which auditory reception reports do not always correspond directly with detailed written documentation preserved in official records, creating a gap between what was potentially heard and what was formally archived as verified communication. This discrepancy is not unusual in analog communication environments, where real-time auditory interpretation must often be condensed into structured written summaries that cannot fully preserve the acoustic complexity of the original signal. Over time, this compression of information contributes to interpretive drift, where later reconstructions rely on secondary summaries rather than direct recordings, gradually increasing the distance between original reception and historical understanding. In the absence of preserved audio data, written logs become the only surviving interface between transmission and memory, even though they were never intended to function as complete representations of the events they describe. Despite the central role of radio operators in maritime communication systems, preserved first-hand testimonies from individual operators regarding specific ambiguous transmissions remain notably limited within surviving archival collections, a situation influenced both by the routine nature of most communications and by the procedural focus of maritime logging systems, which prioritize technical data over personal narrative accounts. In many cases, operator contributions were embedded within standardized reporting formats that left little space for subjective reflection, resulting in records that capture the structure of communication but not the experiential dimension of receiving it. Even when operators did perceive signals as unusual, their interpretations were often absorbed into institutional summaries that removed personal attribution in favor of system-level reporting consistency. This produces a historical record that preserves communication outcomes, but not the perceptual conditions under which those outcomes were formed. In operational practice, radio operators also worked within strict procedural hierarchies that dictated how and when information could be escalated, meaning that even if a transmission was perceived as unusual or potentially significant, its classification depended on confirmation protocols beyond the immediate control of the individual receiving it. This created a layered communication environment in which perception, documentation, and institutional acknowledgement operated as separate stages of validation, each capable of filtering or delaying the transition of information into official recognition. Within such a system, uncertainty could persist, not because it was ignored, but because it remained trapped between procedural thresholds that required external confirmation before progression. The operator's role, therefore, was not to determine final meaning, but to stabilize unstable input long enough for the system to evaluate it. Consequently, the human layer of interpretation that once mediated every signal between transmission and archive becomes increasingly difficult to reconstruct in detail, leaving behind only the structural outline of communication systems without the corresponding experiential context that shaped how those systems were used in practice. The operators who once translated unstable signals into written logs effectively disappear from the narrative, not through absence of function, but through the limitations of how their role was recorded, creating a historical silence that is itself part of the communication system's legacy. Within this silence, the SS Ourang transmission exists less as a singular event and more as a point where interpretation, documentation, and uncertainty briefly converged without producing a fully stable record. Then begins the naval coordination around signals that no longer appear in any active transmission window, naval response that arrived too late. Coordinated response activity gradually emerges from the uncertainty left behind by fragmented operator logs, though the communications prompting that mobilization no longer remain active within monitored maritime channels, creating an immediate procedural imbalance between the urgency of the reported signals and the absence of any continuing transmission that could anchor the response effort to a stable location. By the time naval and coastal authorities begin organizing search coordination measures, the communication window associated with the SS Ourang has already collapsed into silence, leaving response planners dependent on reconstructed estimates assembled from incomplete reception records, uncertain transmission timing, and projected navigational movement through one of the most heavily trafficked maritime corridors in the world. In practical terms, the response begins not with certainty, but with approximation, as authorities attempt to transform fragmented communication traces into an actionable search framework across waters where commercial traffic, environmental instability, and delayed reporting already complicate real-time operational awareness. The absence of a continuing signal does not halt the response. It fundamentally reshapes it into a predictive exercise rather than a direct pursuit. Before satellite-based tracking systems transformed naval search operations, maritime response efforts depended heavily on estimated vessel positioning, derived from intermittent radio contact, shipping schedules, and projected navigational routes, a system that functioned effectively only when communication continuity remained relatively stable. In cases where a vessel ceased transmitting unexpectedly, search coordination required authorities to reconstruct probable movement patterns using the ship's last known heading, expected speed, cargo route assumptions, and any available reports from nearby vessels operating within adjacent shipping lanes. This process introduced unavoidable uncertainty, particularly in regions such as the Strait of Malacca, where vessel density and environmental conditions could alter navigational timing in ways that were difficult to predict with precision. Even a relatively small error in estimated positioning could expand the potential search area dramatically within a matter of hours, especially if ocean currents or weather systems affected the vessel's projected course after communication was lost. The system was not designed for silence, it was designed for continuity, and silence disrupted its most fundamental assumptions. Conflicting interpretations surrounding the SS Ourang's final reported position introduced immediate complications into early response calculations, particularly as varying transmission estimates failed to converge around a single reliable search coordinate. Some reception summaries reportedly suggested one approximate operational sector, while other interpretations implied a broader range of possible movement, extending deeper into heavily trafficked regional waters. Because no continuous transmission sequence existed to establish precise triangulation, response coordinators were forced to work backward from fragmented communication records, whose timing and clarity remained disputed from the beginning. In maritime response operations of the period, such discrepancies could significantly delay deployment efficiency, as naval coordination systems depended on narrowing uncertainty quickly enough to direct vessels toward the most probable location, before environmental drift and traffic movement widened the search zone beyond practical limits. The absence of agreement between signal interpretations did not simply complicate planning, it multiplied the number of possible search realities simultaneously. Once multiple position estimates entered the planning system, coordination centers were required to treat each dataset as simultaneously valid until disproven, resulting in a search model built on overlapping probability fields rather than a single navigational point. This approach, while operationally necessary, introduced exponential expansion of the search area whenever discrepancies could not be resolved, since each additional uncertainty factor multiplied possible vessel trajectories rather than narrowing them. As a result, early response phases often prioritized corridor coverage over precision targeting, assigning multiple vessels to parallel sweep patterns that attempted to account for all plausible movement vectors derived from incomplete communication data. The system did not fail in design, but it was structurally dependent on signal continuity that was no longer available. Hours passing without renewed communication forced response planners to continuously widen projected patrol sectors across sections of sea already complicated by heavy maritime traffic and changing environmental conditions, transforming the search effort from a focused interception attempt into a broader operational sweep through maritime corridors where hundreds of vessels could potentially pass within overlapping navigational ranges. The Strait of Malacca presents particular challenges in this regard due to its narrow geography, combined with exceptionally dense commercial movement, creating a situation where visibility between vessels is not guaranteed despite relative proximity. Atmospheric conditions, night navigation, weather variability, and differing vessel routes all contribute to reducing observational continuity across the corridor, meaning that a ship can move through sections of heavily trafficked water without necessarily drawing sustained visual attention from surrounding traffic. Under these conditions, absence of contact does not equate to absence of presence, which further complicates interpretive assumptions within search planning. Merchant vessels operating within nearby shipping corridors reportedly continued routine transit through the region without documenting any clearly identifiable visual indication of distress associated with the missing cargo ship, an absence that gradually became operationally significant as search efforts expanded without producing reliable confirmation. In maritime investigations, negative sightings can become almost as important as positive reports because they help define the boundaries of probable movement and eliminate sectors where a vessel likely did not remain visible during specific time windows. However, such conclusions remain limited by observational conditions at sea, where visibility can fluctuate rapidly and where crews aboard passing ships are often focused primarily on their own navigation requirements, rather than long-range anomaly detection. In congested shipping environments, vessels may pass within operational range of one another without meaningful interaction, particularly under low visibility conditions or during periods of elevated communication traffic. What is not seen at sea cannot always be interpreted as absence. It may simply be unrecorded presence. Gradually, the operational focus begins shifting away from immediate signal interception and toward the growing possibility that the vessel's final transmissions had originated significantly earlier than initially assumed, a realization that fundamentally alters the structure of the response effort, because every additional hour between transmission and mobilization expands the uncertainty surrounding the vessel's potential location. This temporal distortion is one of the most difficult aspects of maritime search coordination under incomplete communication conditions, since response systems rely heavily on synchronization between reported distress and active deployment. When transmission timing itself becomes uncertain, search planners are forced to calculate multiple possible movement scenarios simultaneously, accounting for drift patterns, navigational deviation, environmental influence, and the possibility that the vessel may no longer be moving under normal operational control. Time becomes not just a measurement, but a variable that reshapes the entire geometry of the search field. Further complicating matters is the fact that oceanic search environments are not static spaces, but continuously shifting operational landscapes shaped by weather systems, traffic flow, and limited observational overlap between vessels and monitoring stations. Even under coordinated search conditions, the visible surface area available to responding ships remains restricted by curvature, visibility range, and environmental obstruction, meaning that locating a silent vessel can become extraordinarily difficult once precise coordinates are lost. In such circumstances, maritime response efforts increasingly depend on narrowing probability fields rather than following direct evidence, forcing naval coordination systems to operate within expanding layers of approximation as time continues to pass without renewed contact. Each expansion of the search area does not bring clarity. It distributes uncertainty across a wider operational grid. Search coordination efforts eventually begin narrowing towards sectors where the probability of physical contact with the vessel appears increasingly plausible despite the continued absence of active communication. Yet the lack of renewed transmission activity creates a growing recognition that any eventual encounter may no longer involve an active distress situation in the conventional sense. This realization changes the psychological structure of the search itself, shifting expectations away from interception and toward recovery, even before visual confirmation is achieved. Within naval operations, such transitions are rarely announced directly during active coordination phases, but they emerge gradually through the changing priorities of deployment patterns, communication procedures, and operational assumptions guiding the search framework. What begins as an attempt to respond becomes, without explicit declaration, an attempt to locate what remains after response is no longer possible. As search grids expand and reposition across broader sectors of the maritime corridor, coordination centres must continually reassess resource allocation, balancing fuel endurance, vessel coverage efficiency, and overlapping patrol patterns against the diminishing probability of active signal reacquisition. Each adjustment to search parameters introduces new layers of operational complexity, as shifting patrol routes must account not only for probable vessel movement, but also for the movement of other commercial traffic that continues to pass through the same region under normal conditions. This creates a dual-layer operational environment in which search vessels must distinguish between routine maritime activity and potential anomaly indicators, a distinction that becomes increasingly difficult as time progresses without confirmation. Communication between coordinating units becomes more structured and procedural as uncertainty increases, with message exchanges focusing less on interpretation and more on alignment of search parameters across multiple operational zones. This shift reflects a broader transition within the response effort, where the goal is no longer immediate identification, but systematic elimination of unproductive sectors. In such phases, language used in coordination often becomes more standardized and less descriptive, reflecting the need to maintain clarity across multiple moving units operating under time-sensitive conditions. Eventually, the search process enters a state in which all available predictive models have been applied, yet no definitive signal reacquisition occurs, leaving only the continuation of systematic coverage as the remaining operational path forward. At this stage, the response effort is no longer driven by expectation of renewed contact, but by procedural obligation to complete coverage of all plausible sectors defined by earlier estimates. This transition marks a subtle but significant shift in operational intent, where search activity becomes self-sustaining even in the absence of reinforcing evidence. By the time visual confirmation finally seemed possible, the silence surrounding the SS Ourang had already taken on the shape of something no transmission could clarify. A ship found without survivors but full of questions. Distant visual confirmation of the SS Ourang finally emerges across open water after prolonged uncertainty had reduced the vessel's reported position to a widening field of approximation rather than a fixed location, bringing an abrupt end to the procedural ambiguity that had dominated the search effort, while simultaneously introducing an entirely different form of uncertainty that no radio transmission or navigational estimate had prepared responders to confront. After hours shaped by fragmented communication reports, disputed timing calculations, and expanding patrol sectors, the sight of the vessel itself should have provided operational clarity, yet the ship's appearance from a distance reportedly produced the opposite effect. Rather than presenting obvious evidence of catastrophic damage or visible distress activity, the SS Ourang appeared unnaturally still against the surrounding waters, retaining enough outward structural normality to complicate immediate interpretation of what may have occurred on board. In maritime search operations, vessels located after communication loss often display recognizable indicators of emergency, whether through visible fire damage, listing, flooding, or distress signaling activity. But the absence of such immediate visual confirmation can sometimes deepen uncertainty more effectively than overt destruction. The transition from coordinated search activity to physical confirmation does not occur as a sudden arrival of clarity, but as a gradual narrowing of uncertainty until visual contact replaces all remaining assumptions, shifting the investigative framework from projected movement patterns to static observation of an unmoving structure. At this stage, prior estimations of location, drift probability, and communication failure no longer function as primary reference points, because the vessel is no longer being tracked through inference, but encountered as an isolated physical entity whose condition must now be interpreted directly. This shift fundamentally alters the nature of inquiry, replacing the logic of search coordination with the logic of inspection, where every observation is anchored to immediate visual and structural reality rather than reconstructed temporal modelling. In this moment, the absence of transmission ceases to be the central problem, because the vessel itself becomes the primary source of unanswered questions. Observed from approaching response craft, the cargo ship reportedly displayed no immediate outward indication of catastrophic structural damage despite the severity implied by earlier distress communications, creating a visible contradiction between the tone of the alleged transmissions and the physical condition of the vessel itself. Accounts associated with the incident consistently describe the SS Ourang as remaining afloat without major external hull failure, visible during initial observation, an important detail because it reduced the likelihood of sudden collision or rapid structural collapse as an immediate explanatory framework. The ship's silhouette reportedly remained intact enough for approaching personnel to identify familiar operational structures from a distance, including cargo areas, deck arrangement, and communication equipment placement, all of which contributed to the unsettling impression that the vessel had not undergone the type of violent maritime event normally associated with abrupt loss of communication and crew activity. At the same time, the complete absence of visible response from the ship introduced a growing tension into the approach process, since maritime crews encountering an operational vessel under distress would ordinarily expect movement, signalling attempts, or at a minimum some indication of human activity once visual contact had been established. Approach procedures conducted around unidentified or unresponsive vessels required boarding personnel to assume unstable onboard conditions until direct inspection could establish otherwise, particularly in cases where communication failure had been preceded by reported distress transmissions whose meaning remained uncertain. Maritime boarding operations under such circumstances are generally cautious by necessity, as responders must consider multiple possibilities simultaneously, including fire hazards, toxic cargo exposure, piracy-related violence, structural instability, or medical emergency conditions affecting surviving crew members. Because the SS Ourang had reportedly ceased all meaningful communication before being located, responders approaching the vessel would have had little reliable information regarding the conditions awaiting them on board, beyond the fragmented radio reports that had already proven difficult to verify with certainty. This procedural uncertainty transformed the act of boarding into more than a routine inspection, forcing response personnel to enter an environment where the operational status of the ship remained fundamentally unknown despite its outwardly stable appearance. Beyond the exterior silence of the drifting vessel, early inspection accounts describe operational sections of the ship appearing unusually undisturbed in ways that complicated immediate interpretation of the emergency, as responders reportedly encountered areas that retained signs of ordinary maritime routine rather than the widespread structural chaos often associated with catastrophic onboard events. Navigation areas, deck pathways, and portions of the vessel's operational environment appeared sufficiently intact to suggest that normal activity may have continued aboard the ship relatively close to the point at which communication ceased. This apparent continuity between routine operation and sudden silence created a deeply unusual investigative atmosphere because it implied interruption without a clearly visible cause. In many maritime disasters, physical evidence immediately directs investigators toward a probable explanation, whether through visible fire patterns, collision damage, flooding progression, or mechanical failure indicators, but the SS Ourang reportedly presented no such straightforward interpretive pathway during initial inspection. Absent from the initial survey were many of the physical indicators commonly associated with severe maritime disaster scenarios, such as large-scale fire damage, flooding, or visible collision impact, leaving responders without an immediately identifiable mechanism capable of explaining the complete collapse of communication and onboard activity implied by the earlier transmissions. This absence of obvious causation became one of the defining features of the case, because it prevented investigators from quickly situating the incident within established categories of maritime emergency response. Even when vessels are found after prolonged silence, search and recovery personnel generally expect some visible evidence capable of narrowing probable explanations during the earlier stages of inspection. The SS Ourang instead appeared to occupy an unsettling intermediate condition in which operational continuity and catastrophic implication existed side by side without fully aligning into a coherent sequence of events. Cargo areas reportedly showed no immediately identifiable evidence of violent disruption, while large sections of the vessel retained enough structural normality to reinforce the growing perception that the ship's silence could not yet be easily connected to any single observable cause. Increasingly, response personnel encountered a widening contradiction between the urgency suggested by reported transmissions and the limited amount of directly observable evidence available aboard the vessel itself, a contradiction that appears repeatedly in later summaries of the incident and contributes significantly to its enduring place within maritime mystery discussions. In procedural terms, responders arriving at a silent vessel after distress communication would typically begin constructing a timeline linking transmission content to observable physical evidence. Yet the SS Ourang complicated this process because the ship's condition did not immediately correspond to expectations established by the alleged final messages. The resulting interpretive gap gradually transformed the vessel from a search target into an unresolved investigative environment, where every intact operational detail deepened uncertainty rather than reducing it. Even the continued physical stability of the ship reportedly became difficult to reconcile psychologically with the intensity associated with the phrase later attributed to the final transmission. Closer examination of interior spaces gradually redirected attention away from the ship's structural condition and toward the unmoving presence of the crew distributed throughout various sections of the vessel, introducing a level of unease that early exterior observations had not yet fully conveyed. Initial attention had focused primarily on whether the vessel itself displayed evidence of fire, collision, flooding, or piracy-related damage, but as responders moved further through operational areas, the absence of active human response became impossible to separate from the broader mystery surrounding the ship. What reportedly distinguished the scene was not visible chaos, but an overwhelming stillness that appeared to persist across multiple sections of the vessel, without a clear indication of the event capable of producing it. This transition from structural inspection to direct human observation fundamentally altered the nature of the investigation, because it shifted focus away from mechanical explanation and toward conditions that seemed increasingly difficult to categorize within conventional maritime emergency frameworks. Only after the silence aboard the SS Ourang was examined more closely did responders begin confronting details that seemed increasingly difficult to reconcile with any ordinary maritime emergency. The bodies, the conditions, and the unnatural calm. Interior inspection of the SS Ourang gradually shifts the focus away from the vessel itself and toward the human stillness distributed throughout its silent compartments and operational spaces, where the absence of movement appears increasingly difficult to reconcile with the routine structural normality observed during the initial boarding phase. Early response personnel entering the ship reportedly encountered an environment in which operational continuity and unexplained collapse seemed to exist side by side without immediate resolution, creating an atmosphere that differed sharply from the aftermath typically associated with severe maritime disaster scenarios. Instead of widespread visible destruction or evidence of frantic evacuation activity, many areas of the vessel appeared suspended in a condition of interruption rather than violent disruption, as though ordinary shipboard processes had ceased without leaving behind a clearly identifiable sequence explaining how or why that cessation had occurred. This gradual transition from exterior inspection to direct exposure to the ship's interior transformed the investigation from a search operation into something far more difficult to categorize within conventional maritime response frameworks. Scattered across multiple sections of the ship, crew members were reportedly discovered in positions that appeared disconnected from any organized emergency response or evacuation attempt, an observation that contributed heavily to the enduring uncertainty surrounding the incident in later maritime discussions. Accounts associated with the SS Ourang consistently describe personnel being located throughout different operational areas rather than concentrated around lifeboat stations, damage control positions, or coordinated emergency gathering points normally associated with escalating onboard crisis conditions. In maritime emergencies involving fire, flooding, collision, or mechanical failure, crews are generally expected to converge towards specific procedural responses shaped by training and chain-of-command coordination. Yet the reported distribution of the SS Ourang's crew did not easily conform to these expectations, creating the impression that whatever occurred aboard the vessel may have interrupted ordinary response behaviour before any structured emergency process could fully develop. The apparent stillness of these positions later became one of the most discussed aspects of the incident, because it suggested interruption without clear evidence of physical struggle or rapid environmental destruction. Descriptions preserved within later summaries of the incident frequently reference unusual facial expressions observed among portions of the crew, though the consistency and reliability of these accounts remain difficult to establish with certainty due to the fragmented nature of surviving documentation and the tendency of later retellings to amplify emotionally striking details over time. Some secondary summaries describe expressions interpreted as fear, shock, or distress, while others present more restrained observations that focus primarily on the absence of visible injury rather than emotional appearance. Because no fully standardized forensic documentation from the scene has survived within publicly accessible records, later interpretations rely heavily on reconstructed accounts, whose precision cannot always be independently verified. This uncertainty is important because the SS Ourang story gradually evolved beyond maritime reporting into broader mystery literature, where dramatic embellishment sometimes became difficult to separate from likely original observations. Even so, the repeated appearance of references to unusual expressions across multiple retellings contributed significantly to the atmosphere surrounding the case, reinforcing the perception that responders encountered something aboard the ship that resisted ordinary explanatory language. Throughout the vessel's enclosed interior areas, responders reportedly encountered an atmosphere marked less by visible destruction than by an unsettling absence of movement, sound, or active mechanical disruption, conditions that appear repeatedly in retrospective descriptions of the discovery. Maritime vessels normally generate a constant background of operational noise through engines, ventilation systems, cargo movement, and crew activity, creating an environment defined by mechanical continuity and human coordination, even under routine travel conditions. The sudden replacement of that operational rhythm with sustained silence can itself become psychologically disorienting for boarding personnel accustomed to the sensory patterns associated with active ships at sea. In accounts related to the SS Ourang, this environmental stillness is often emphasized alongside the apparent intactness of many operational spaces, creating a contradiction between atmosphere and structure that deepen the difficulty of immediate interpretation. Some later discussions also reference unusually warm conditions aboard portions of the vessel, though the exact reliability and source of such details remain uncertain within surviving records. Missing from many reported observations were the kinds of immediately recognizable physical injuries or environmental damage patterns typically associated with severe maritime disasters, leaving responders without an obvious causal framework capable of explaining the condition of the crew and the abrupt collapse of shipboard activity. In cases involving poisoning, fire, flooding, combat-related violence, or mechanical catastrophe, investigators generally expect corresponding physical indicators capable of narrowing investigative direction during the earlier stages of examination. Yet reports associated with the SS Ourang repeatedly emphasize ambiguity rather than clarity, noting the absence of extensive visible trauma, major structural devastation, or clear signs of prolonged onboard struggle. This absence became increasingly significant because it prevented investigators from easily aligning the incident with established maritime emergency categories. Instead of reducing uncertainty, direct physical observation seemed to multiply it, producing a situation in which the visible evidence aboard the ship did not fully correspond either to the intensity of the reported transmissions or to conventional expectations surrounding mass casualty events at sea. Retrospective examinations of the SS Ourang incident increasingly reveal how direct observation aboard the vessel failed to produce a stable explanatory narrative even among those involved in the initial inspection, a pattern that contributed heavily to the long-term instability of the story itself. In many maritime investigations, early observations gradually consolidate into a clearer reconstruction as reports are compared and physical evidence is analysed, but the SS Ourang appears to have followed the opposite trajectory, where later retellings diverged rather than converged. certain descriptions became amplified in later mystery-focused interpretations, while other operational details remained vague or inconsistently preserved across surviving summaries. This process complicates modern attempts to distinguish likely original observations from later narrative expansion, particularly because many references to the incident rely on secondary or tertiary compilations, rather than direct investigative documentation. The result is a layered historical problem in which the uncertainty surrounding the event becomes inseparable from the uncertainty surrounding how the event itself was recorded and transmitted through time. Gradually, the uncertainty surrounding the condition of the crew begins extending beyond the ship itself and into the fragmented documentary record that later attempts to reconstruct the event, where discrepancies in reported details, missing procedural documentation, and inconsistent archival references begin undermining efforts to establish a fully stable historical timeline. Some accounts differ regarding the exact sequence of discovery, while others vary in their descriptions of environmental conditions, crew positioning, or subsequent handling of the vessel after boarding. These inconsistencies do not necessarily indicate fabrication, since fragmented maritime records from the mid-20th century were often vulnerable to loss, translation variance, and incomplete preservation, particularly in cases that did not generate a comprehensive international investigation. However, the cumulative effect of these gaps is that the SS Ourang gradually becomes more difficult to reconstruct, with certainty the deeper researchers move into the surviving documentation. Meanwhile, the surviving documentation surrounding the SS Ourang begins separating into conflicting versions that no longer align cleanly with one another. Conflicting logs and missing maritime records. After the SS Ourang is physically accounted for, investigative efforts shift away from onboard conditions and move toward the documentary frameworks responsible for recording its final, operational timeline, a transition that often appears procedural on paper but becomes significantly more complex in practice once multiple institutional record systems begin to be compared against one another. In maritime investigations of this kind, the assumption is typically that physical discovery will help stabilize earlier uncertainty, allowing recorded logs, communication records, and navigational entries to be reconciled into a coherent sequence of events. In the case of the SS Ourang, however, the shift toward documentation does not consolidate the narrative, but instead exposes additional layers of inconsistency that were not fully visible during the search phase. The vessel itself may now be physically present in the historical record, but the written systems that were meant to define its final movements begin to behave in ways that resist alignment, creating a second form of instability that exists independently of the ship's physical condition. Voyage entries preserved within maritime registries initially present a structured operational path that begins to fracture when aligned against reconstructed navigational estimates, particularly as differences emerge between planned routing data and later inferred movement patterns derived from partial communication records and search coordination assumptions. Shipping logs, by design, are intended to function as continuous documentation of a vessel's intended and actual movement across time, recording departure points, estimated arrival windows, and key navigational checkpoints that help establish a reliable framework for post-voyage reconstruction. However, when these entries are compared against later analyses derived from fragmented distress signals and response coordination timelines, subtle discrepancies begin to appear in the assumed progression of the vessel through its final operational corridor. These discrepancies do not necessarily indicate immediate error within any single record, but rather suggest that the various systems responsible for documenting maritime movement may not have captured the same version of events with equal completeness or temporal precision. The divergence is not dramatic in isolation, but cumulative when multiple systems are aligned simultaneously. Time-stamped radio records attributed to multiple monitoring points introduce subtle but persistent mismatches that complicate reconstruction of the vessel's final communication sequence, particularly when attempting to establish a unified timeline of transmission activity across different reception locations. In maritime communication systems, multiple stations may receive overlapping or partial transmissions that are then independently logged before being consolidated into broad communication summaries, a process that can introduce minor variations in recorded timing or interpretation depending on reception quality and operator conditions at the moment of recording. When these records are later compared, even small inconsistencies in timestamp alignment can significantly affect the reconstruction of event sequences, especially in cases where communication gaps already exist due to signal loss or environmental interference. In the SS Ourang case, these mismatches contribute to a broader difficulty in establishing a single, authoritative sequence of final transmissions, as no fully continuous communication chain appears to survive across all recorded monitoring points. The absence of continuity forces analysts to rely on stitched timelines rather than direct sequences. A further complication arises from the fact that maritime timestamp systems of the period were not universally synchronized across all operational stations, meaning that recorded times often reflect local station standards rather than unified global time references. This introduces additional layers of temporal drift when attempting cross-system alignment, as even accurately recorded events may appear displaced when viewed through a standardized analytical framework. When multiple independently recorded logs are compared under these conditions, the result is not a clean chronological sequence, but a series of partially overlapping timelines that require interpretive normalization before they can be meaningfully compared. In practice, this means that reconstruction becomes less about identifying a single sequence and more about reconciling multiple time-dependent perspectives of the same operational period. No verified first-hand accounts from surviving crew members appear within the available archival material capable of clarifying the internal conditions during the final stage of the voyage, leaving investigators reliant on secondary documentation systems that were never designed to capture experiential detail from within the ship itself. In standard maritime investigations, survivor testimony often serves as a stabilizing reference point that helps align technical records with human observation, providing context that can resolve ambiguities in timing, environmental conditions, or sequence of events. The absence of such accounts in the SS Ourang case removes this interpretive layer entirely, forcing reconstruction efforts to depend exclusively on institutional records and observational summaries generated externally to the vessel. This absence does not simply reduce available information, but fundamentally alters the structure of interpretation, as there is no internal narrative source capable of confirming or challenging the consistency of external documentation. The result is a record system without experiential anchoring. Port Authority filings and maritime oversight records associated with the SS Ourang contain discontinuities, where expected procedural entries are either incomplete or entirely absent, particularly in sections that would normally record detailed post-departure updates, communication confirmations, or interim status reports during extended voyages. Maritime administrative systems are generally structured to maintain sequential documentation across multiple stages of a vessel's journey, ensuring that key operational events are recorded in alignment with regulatory and safety requirements. When gaps appear within these systems, they often signal either procedural breakdown, lost documentation, or unrecorded transitions that were never formally entered into the archival chain. In the SS Ourang case, the presence of such discontinuities introduces additional uncertainty into efforts to reconstruct the vessel's final hours, as critical segments of the administrative record cannot be fully verified or cross-referenced against corresponding communication data. The missing entries do not point to a single failure point, but suggest multiple points of incomplete transmission within the administrative process itself. When naval records are compared directly with civilian shipping logs and communication archives, the resulting discrepancies resist alignment into a single coherent timeline, creating a situation in which each dataset appears internally structured yet externally incompatible with the others. Naval records tend to emphasize operational response timing and coordinated search activity, while civilian shipping logs prioritize vessel movement and commercial routing data, and communication archives focus on transmission reception and signal classification. When these independent systems are brought together for comparative analysis, differences in timing conventions, reporting standards, and data completeness begin to surface in ways that prevent seamless integration. In the SS Ourang case, these inconsistencies do not collapse into a unified explanation, but instead expand into parallel interpretations of the same temporal sequence, each supported by its own partial evidentiary framework. The more systems are added to the comparison, the less stable the overall reconstruction becomes. A further structural complication arises from the fact that each documentation system was optimized for internal consistency rather than cross-system compatibility, meaning that naval, civilian, and communication archives each developed their own standards for time representation, event classification, and record prioritization. When these systems are later compared, discrepancies emerge not because any single record is incorrect, but because each framework encodes reality through a different operational logic. Naval systems prioritize response sequencing, civilian logs prioritize navigational intent, and communication archives prioritize signal reception fidelity, resulting in three parallel interpretations of the same temporal window that cannot be fully aligned without introducing interpretive assumptions. A key structural issue in cross-system maritime analysis is that each documentation framework is optimized for a different operational purpose, meaning that alignment between them is not guaranteed even when they describe the same physical event sequence. Communication logs prioritize signal integrity and reception clarity, shipping logs prioritize navigational intent and cargo movement, and naval records prioritize response timing and operational coordination. Because these systems are not designed to interlock perfectly, discrepancies can arise even in fully functional operational environments. When incomplete or fragmented data is introduced into this structure, as in the SS Ourang case, the divergence between systems increases rather than decreases, since each framework attempts to compensate for missing information using its own internal logic rather than a shared standard of reconstruction. Over time, repeated attempts to reconcile these records introduce additional interpretive layers, as analysts must infer missing data points in order to construct usable timelines. These inferred segments are not arbitrary, but based on established maritime reasoning models, yet they remain hypothetical insertions within otherwise factual datasets. As these reconstructed elements accumulate, the boundary between recorded data and interpretive supplementation becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish, particularly when later analyses rely on previously reconstructed versions of the timeline rather than original source entries. This creates a cascading effect in which reconstruction builds upon reconstruction, gradually increasing structural distance from the original documentation. With each layer of comparison, the SS Ourang incident shifts further away from a singular reconstruction and begins existing as multiple conflicting documentary versions of the same sequence, each version supported by fragments of legitimate record, but none capable of fully encompassing the entire event without contradiction. This fragmentation is not unusual in complex maritime investigations involving incomplete communication data and delayed response coordination, yet the degree of divergence in this case creates an unusually unstable archival environment in which even basic chronological ordering becomes difficult to maintain with confidence. As additional records are examined, the inconsistencies do not resolve but instead multiply, suggesting that the underlying documentation may have been shaped by conditions of loss, delay, or partial transmission that were never fully captured within a single, authoritative system. The record does not fail in one place, it fractures across many. Within the fragmented archive trail, each reference to the SS Ourang begins to behave less like confirmation and more like a separate version of an event that no longer matches the others. Theories of toxic exposure, piracy, and signal corruption. Interpretive frameworks surrounding the SS Ourang begin to emerge only after inconsistencies within the recovered documentation make direct reconstruction of events increasingly unstable, forcing investigators and later analysts to shift from attempting to rebuild a single timeline toward assembling competing explanatory models that could account for fragments of evidence that no longer align under a unified narrative. At this stage of the investigation, the ship is no longer the primary source of uncertainty, since it has already been physically examined, but rather the accumulated record of what might have happened begins to take on greater significance than the physical observations themselves. Once documentation fails to produce a coherent sequence, explanatory theories begin to form as structural substitutes for missing continuity, each attempting to stabilize a different portion of the same fragmented dataset. In maritime investigative contexts, this transition is not unusual, but in the SS Ourang case, the divergence between explanations becomes unusually persistent, with each hypothesis drawing support from partial evidence, while simultaneously conflicting with other equally plausible interpretations. Chemical exposure theories associated with cargo contamination propose that onboard materials may have produced conditions capable of rapidly incapacitating crew activity under confined shipboard environments, particularly in scenarios involving improperly secured or misidentified industrial substances carried within standard freight operations. Such theories typically emerge in maritime investigations when physical conditions on board appear inconsistent with visible structural damage, as chemical exposure can, in principle, produce severe human impact without leaving extensive external destruction. Within this interpretive framework, attention is directed toward the possibility that environmental conditions inside enclosed compartments may have shifted in ways that affected crew behaviour before external signs of distress became apparent. However, these explanations remain limited by the absence of direct chemical verification within surviving records, leaving the theory dependent on inferred compatibility rather than confirmed material evidence. As a result, toxic exposure remains a structurally plausible but unverified model that explains certain observational gaps while leaving other aspects of the case unresolved. Maritime security analyses referencing regional shipping risks consider the possibility of external interference, although corresponding physical evidence within recovered accounts remains insufficiently conclusive to establish a definitive incident of confrontation or hostile boarding. This line of interpretation is grounded in broader historical awareness of security challenges in heavily trafficked maritime corridors, where vessel density and geographic complexity can create conditions under which external encounters may occur without immediate or clearly documented observation. In such scenarios, the absence of clear distress indicators or structural damage can be interpreted in multiple ways, including the possibility that any external interaction may not have produced conventional physical signatures typically associated with maritime conflict. However, in the case of the SS Ourang, the lack of corroborating evidence across multiple inspection summaries prevents this explanation from advancing beyond speculative reconstruction, leaving it as one of several competing interpretations rather than a confirmed causal framework. Radio transmission analysis highlights how atmospheric distortion and frequency overlap within busy maritime corridors can significantly alter or fragment the integrity of distress communication signals, particularly in regions where multiple vessels operate simultaneously across overlapping transmission ranges. In analog communication systems, signal degradation can occur through a variety of mechanisms, including environmental interference, equipment limitations, and channel congestion, all of which can contribute to partial or distorted message reception. When multiple monitoring stations independently receive fragments of the same transmission, minor variations in interpretation or timing can accumulate into larger inconsistencies during later reconstruction efforts. Within the SS Ourang case, this interpretive pathway is frequently invoked to explain discrepancies in reported distress messages, including variations in phrasing, timing, and signal clarity. Yet while signal distortion offers a technically grounded explanation for communication irregularities, it does not fully account for the broader physical and documentary inconsistencies observed in the case, leaving it as one component within a larger unresolved system of interpretation. Each proposed explanation appears capable of accounting for isolated aspects of the SS Ourang case, yet none successfully reconcile all recorded inconsistencies when evaluated collectively, creating a condition in which the investigative framework becomes defined not by convergence, but by persistent divergence. Toxic exposure theories address certain aspects of onboard inactivity. Piracy-related interpretations attempt to account for potential external disruption, and signal distortion models explain communication irregularities, but each framework encounters structural limitations when extended across the full range of available evidence. This overlapping partiality produces a situation in which the case resists closure, not because evidence is absent, but because available explanations distribute compatibility unevenly across different segments of the same event. As a result, the SS Ourang becomes an example of interpretive fragmentation, where multiple explanatory systems coexist without producing a singular dominant resolution. Official maritime review processes frequently avoid definitive classification in cases where available evidence fragments into multiple incompatible explanatory categories, particularly when doing so would require selecting one interpretation over others without sufficient evidentiary priority. In such situations, investigative bodies may preserve multiple hypotheses in parallel rather than formally endorsing a single conclusion, especially when the evidentiary record lacks the continuity required for definitive determination. This procedural restraint is not uncommon in complex maritime investigations, where incomplete data, missing records, or conflicting accounts prevent final categorization within established incident classifications. Within the SS Ourang case, this institutional caution contributes to the long-term persistence of uncertainty, as the absence of a final authoritative classification allows multiple interpretations to remain active within secondary analyses without resolution. Over time, competing interpretations surrounding the SS Ourang accumulate without convergence, leaving the incident positioned between multiple incomplete analytical frameworks rather than a single resolved account, and gradually transforming it into a case defined more by interpretive plurality than by factual closure. Each successive attempt to re-examine the available evidence introduces additional layers of explanation without eliminating earlier contradictions, resulting in a widening interpretive field rather than a narrowing investigative focus. In this way, the SS Ourang does not settle into historical resolution, but instead continues to exist as a layered construct of overlapping theories, each partially supported yet none fully sufficient to encompass the entirety of the recorded inconsistencies. In subsequent archival references, the SS Ourang investigation appears less as an active inquiry and more as a case gradually absorbed into unresolved maritime classification records, the investigation that quietly disappeared into archives. As competing theories surrounding the SS Ourang continue to circulate, formal maritime inquiry systems redirect attention toward the original investigative structures established during the earliest phases of response, where procedural frameworks were initially intended to stabilize uncertainty rather than accommodate the expanding range of later interpretations. In standard maritime practice, early investigative mechanisms are designed to collect operational data, secure testimony where available, and consolidate environmental and navigational evidence into a coherent preliminary report that can later be refined through additional review. However, in the case of the SS Ourang, the shift back toward these foundational structures reveals an additional layer of instability, because the original investigative output itself appears incomplete when viewed alongside the broader accumulation of fragmented records that developed afterward. Instead of functioning as a stable reference point, the earliest investigative layer becomes part of the uncertainty, requiring reinterpretation rather than providing resolution. Maritime inquiry frameworks governing incidents of this nature typically operate within defined jurisdictional and procedural boundaries that determine how far investigative authority can extend across international waters and reporting systems, particularly when incidents occur in regions involving overlapping national interests or complex shipping lanes. These frameworks are generally structured to ensure that investigations remain consistent with established maritime law, safety protocols, and interagency coordination standards, allowing findings to be recorded in a way that can be verified across multiple institutional systems. Yet such a structure also introduces inherent limitations, especially when incidents involve incomplete datasets or missing operational continuity, as the investigative process must then proceed without full access to all relevant variables. In cases like the SS Ourang, these boundaries become especially significant because they define not only what can be concluded, but also what must remain unclassified or unresolved when evidence fails to align with procedural expectations. Preliminary investigative outputs associated with the SS Ourang case appear in fragmented forms across different reporting stages, with sections of documentation failing to consolidate into a single finalized account that fully captures the sequence of events from departure to discovery. In many maritime investigations, preliminary reports serve as transitional documents that bridge initial response activity with more comprehensive final analysis, allowing early findings to be revised as additional data becomes available. However, when those preliminary records remain fragmented or incomplete, later attempts at synthesis become increasingly difficult, particularly when discrepancies arise between early observations and subsequent interpretations. In the SS Ourang case, this fragmentation contributes to a layered documentary structure in which no single report can be treated as fully authoritative, requiring instead a comparative approach that highlights inconsistencies rather than resolving them. Public-facing maritime archives gradually reflect a reduced emphasis on the SS Ourang case, as later cataloguing systems prioritize classification over detailed narrative reconstruction, a shift that often occurs when investigations remain unresolved or lack sufficient closure for formal archival consolidation. Within institutional record-keeping practices, cases that do not produce definitive conclusions may be reclassified into broader categories of maritime incidents, communication anomalies, or operational irregularities, depending on how their available data is interpreted within standardized reporting frameworks. This process does not necessarily erase the original investigation, but it can reduce its visibility within publicly accessible systems, making detailed reconstruction more difficult for later researchers. In the SS Ourang case, this archival repositioning contributes to the gradual dilution of the incident's presence within formal records, even as fragmented references continue to persist in secondary or contextual documentation. Access to complete investigative documentation remains uneven across archival repositories, with certain records either partially restricted or absent from publicly available maritime databases, a condition that often reflects differences in classification status, preservation practices, or institutional access policies rather than deliberate omission. Maritime record systems frequently operate across multiple jurisdictions and administrative layers, meaning that a single investigative file may exist in varying degrees of completeness depending on the repository being consulted. When documents are partially restricted, it is typically due to procedural classification standards or archival preservation protocols that limit full public release until certain conditions are met. In the SS Ourang case, this uneven accessibility introduces an additional layer of uncertainty, as researchers attempting to reconstruct the investigation must rely on incomplete or secondary sources that may not fully reflect the original scope of the inquiry. The absence of a definitive concluding report produces a sustained informational gap within maritime records, where unresolved cases persist through indirect references rather than formal closure statements, allowing them to remain present in institutional memory without achieving full analytical resolution. In structured investigative systems, a final report typically serves as the anchor point that consolidates findings, establishes conclusions, and formally closes the case within the archival framework. When such a document is missing or never fully completed, the case remains in a transitional state, neither fully active nor formally resolved, creating a residual category of unresolved inquiry. In the SS Ourang case, this absence ensures that later references to the incident continue to circulate without a single authoritative endpoint, reinforcing the sense of fragmentation that defines its archival presence. The SS Ourang case gradually loses its status as a single documented investigation and begins appearing across maritime records as fragmented references detached from any unified case identity, a transformation that reflects how unresolved incidents can evolve within archival systems over time. As documentation disperses across multiple repositories and classification layers, the original coherence of the investigation becomes increasingly difficult to reconstruct, replaced instead by isolated references embedded within unrelated reports and analytical summaries. This shift does not imply the disappearance of the case itself, but rather a change in how it is represented within institutional memory, where it exists more as a distributed reference point than as a consolidated investigative file. In this state, the SS Ourang becomes less a singular event preserved in full documentation, and more a pattern of references that appear intermittently across maritime records without consistent context. Long-range maritime archives begin surfacing the SS Ourang only through fragmented citations embedded in unrelated investigations into signal anomalies and communication irregularities, delayed interpretations and pre-investigative hesitation patterns. In many operational environments, the handling of ambiguous communication does not occur as a single decision point, but instead unfolds across multiple internal review layers that are not immediately visible to external observers. These layers are designed to separate raw signal intake from interpretive classification, ensuring that initial reception is not mistaken for confirmed meaning. Each layer applies a different filtering logic, beginning with mechanical signal validation, followed by pattern consistency checks, and finally human-assisted interpretation, which introduces contextual reasoning into otherwise technical assessments. The cumulative effect of these stages is not only increased accuracy, but also extended temporal distance between reception and resolution, meaning that even clear anomalies can remain unclassified for significant periods of operational time. One of the less visible aspects of this process is the concept of interpretive buffering, where incoming signals are temporarily held in a non-classified state while the system evaluates whether they belong to existing known categories. During this buffering phase, the signal is neither dismissed nor confirmed, but instead stored in an intermediate analytical state that allows for later reassessment if additional data becomes available. This mechanism is particularly important in environments where signal density is high and individual transmissions cannot be immediately isolated with full certainty. As a result, the system effectively creates a temporary memory layer for uncertainty, allowing unresolved inputs to persist without forcing premature categorization. The complexity of this process increases further when multiple monitoring stations report inconsistent interpretations of the same signal event. In such cases, the system does not immediately prioritize one interpretation over another, but instead attempts to reconstruct a composite signal profile based on overlapping fragments of data. This reconstruction process can be hindered by differences in reception timing, atmospheric distortion, and equipment calibration variations between stations. When alignment cannot be achieved within acceptable confidence thresholds, the system may postpone classification entirely, resulting in extended periods where the event remains actively observed but not formally defined. Human operators working within these systems are required to navigate this uncertainty by applying interpretive judgment that accounts for both technical data and environmental context. However, this judgment is constrained by procedural frameworks that limit the degree to which subjective interpretation can override system-defined thresholds. In practice, this means that operators may recognize patterns that suggest urgency without having sufficient procedural justification to escalate the case immediately. This creates a tension between perception and authorization, where awareness of a potential anomaly does not always translate into immediate operational action. Another contributing factor to delayed interpretation is the presence of signal contamination, where multiple transmissions overlap within the same frequency range, creating composite audio or data structures that are difficult to separate into individual sources. This is especially common in heavily trafficked maritime corridors, where vessel density leads to continuous background transmission activity. In such environments, even signals that contain distinct structural characteristics may be partially masked by concurrent communication traffic, reducing their clarity and delaying accurate classification. The system compensates for this by applying iterative filtering techniques, but these techniques themselves require time to converge on stable results. In addition to environmental and technical factors, procedural hierarchy also plays a significant role in delaying interpretation. Communication events are typically assigned priority levels based on initial assessment confidence, and lower confidence events are placed into extended review cycles that may involve periodic re-evaluation rather than continuous analysis. These cycles ensure that system resources are not overextended, but also introduce temporal gaps in active monitoring, during which signal clarity may degrade further or additional contextual information may be lost. This creates a structural dependency on time-sensitive data retention, where the value of a signal can diminish simply due to processing delay. As these layers interact, a compounding effect emerges in which uncertainty is not resolved linearly, but instead accumulates across successive stages of evaluation. Each layer introduces its own form of interpretive delay, and when combined, these delays produce extended periods during which the status of a communication event remains indeterminate. This indeterminacy is not treated as failure, but as an expected operational condition, reflecting the inherent limitations of real-time interpretation in complex signal environments. The role of redundancy in maritime communication systems further complicates this process. While redundancy is designed to improve reliability by ensuring that multiple sources can confirm the same event, it also increases the number of variables that must be reconciled before classification can occur. When redundant inputs disagree, the system must not only evaluate each input individually, but also determine the reliability hierarchy among sources, which introduces additional layers of comparative analysis. This process can significantly extend the time required to reach a stable interpretation, particularly when no single source provides a clearly dominant signal profile. Environmental interference adds another layer of complexity, as atmospheric conditions can alter signal propagation in ways that are not immediately predictable or consistent across different monitoring locations. Temperature gradients, humidity levels, and electromagnetic disturbances can all contribute to variations in signal reception quality, meaning that the same transmission may appear differently depending on where and how it is received. This spatial inconsistency requires additional normalization procedures before signals can be compared meaningfully across stations, further extending the interpretive timeline. Even after a signal has been partially reconstructed and normalized, the final stage of classification still depends on contextual validation, where the system evaluates whether the reconstructed pattern matches known categories of communication behavior. If no sufficient match is found, the signal may remain in an unresolved category pending future comparison with newly acquired data. This creates a form of deferred classification, where interpretation is postponed not due to lack of information alone, but due to absence of sufficient contextual alignment. At a structural level, this entire process reflects a fundamental design principle within maritime communication systems that uncertainty must be managed rather than eliminated. The system is not designed to produce immediate clarity in all cases, but to ensure that clarity, when it emerges, is based on stable and verifiable alignment of multiple data sources. This design choice prioritizes long-term accuracy over immediate resolution, accepting that some level of interpretive delay is an unavoidable consequence of operating in complex and variable environments. As a result, communication events that fall into these extended evaluation cycles often remain in a state of procedural suspension, where they are neither escalated nor dismissed, but instead continuously re-evaluated until sufficient convergence occurs or the signal becomes too degraded for further meaningful analysis. In such cases, the system does not reach a definitive conclusion, but instead archives the event as unresolved, preserving whatever partial data remains for potential future reference. This entire structure creates a layered temporal experience of communication interpretation, where meaning does not emerge at the moment of reception, but gradually forms through successive stages of filtering, comparison, and validation. The delay between signal and interpretation is therefore not incidental but structural, embedded into the very architecture of maritime communication systems as a necessary condition for maintaining reliability in uncertain environments. Patterns of hesitation in communication systems do not remain isolated within individual incidents, but gradually reappear in later analyses, where unresolved signals are reinterpreted across broader maritime history. Echoes across maritime radio history and lingering anomalies. Once formal maritime records stop treating the SS Ourang as an active investigative file, its presence shifts into indirect references embedded inside broader discussions of unresolved radio communication anomalies, where it no longer functions as a central case under examination, but instead becomes a peripheral marker used to illustrate how certain signal-based incidents resist complete reconstruction. In this phase of its historical presence, the vessel is no longer discussed through direct evidentiary frameworks, but through secondary interpretive contexts that rely on incomplete transmissions, partial documentation, and retrospective comparison with similar communication disruptions recorded in other eras of maritime history. The shift is subtle but significant, because it marks the transition from structured inquiry into associative memory, where the SS Ourang is referenced not for what is known with certainty, but for what remains unresolved in the structure of recorded maritime communication itself. As a result, the case begins to function less as an isolated incident and more as a conceptual anchor point for discussing broader patterns of ambiguity in historical radio records. Unrelated analyses of maritime radio disturbances occasionally include brief references to the SS Ourang as a comparative example within broader examinations of distorted or incomplete distress transmissions, particularly in discussions focused on how environmental interference, equipment limitations, and transmission overlap can affect signal clarity in densely trafficked shipping corridors. These references do not position the SS Ourang as the primary subject of investigation, but instead use it as a contextual illustration when examining how fragmented communication can lead to long-term interpretive uncertainty. In such contexts, the case is often presented alongside other examples of degraded or partially recorded transmissions, forming part of a wider analytical framework concerned with understanding how information loss occurs in analog maritime communication systems. However, the inclusion of the SS Ourang in these discussions is often based on secondary referencing rather than direct archival engagement, which further contributes to the gradual distancing of the case from its original investigative context. Older documented cases of maritime distress signals that suffered from fragmentation or misinterpretation are sometimes discussed alongside the SS Ourang, even when no direct operational connection exists between the incidents, creating a comparative landscape in which unrelated events are linked through shared patterns of communication failure rather than shared causality. This comparative approach is common in communication history analysis, where researchers examine structural similarities across different incidents in order to better understand how signal degradation and transmission loss can produce similar interpretive outcomes. In this context, the SS Ourang becomes part of a broader analytical grouping that includes various historically documented signal anomalies, each contributing to a collective understanding of how incomplete transmissions can shape investigative uncertainty. Yet despite these associations, no definitive technical or operational linkage has been established between these cases, leaving their grouping as an interpretive construct rather than a verified connection. Residual references to the alleged final transmission associated with the SS Ourang continue to circulate in secondary summaries, despite the absence of any preserved original recording or verifiable primary source, which means that all modern references to the phrase are necessarily reconstructed through fragmented accounts rather than direct archival evidence. This reconstructed status introduces a persistent uncertainty into how the transmission is represented, since variations in phrasing and interpretation emerge depending on the source material being referenced. Over time, these variations accumulate, producing a layered version of the transmission that exists more as a collective memory artifact than as a singular documented record. In the absence of an original recording, the transmission becomes a conceptual reconstruction, shaped by repetition, reinterpretation, and the limitations of historical documentation practices. Limitations inherent in mid-century analog radio recording and logging systems prevent any definitive reconstruction of certain fragmented transmissions, leaving gaps that cannot be retroactively resolved through modern analysis, even when contemporary technology is applied to reinterpret surviving data. These limitations include incomplete logging practices, variable recording standards across different stations, and the absence of synchronized global verification systems capable of preserving transmissions in full fidelity across multiple reception points. As a result, many historical signals exist only in partial form, reconstructed through overlapping accounts rather than continuous recordings. In the case of the SS Ourang, this technological constraint plays a central role in why the transmission history remains fragmented, since the available evidence cannot be unified into a single definitive signal record without introducing interpretive assumptions. Discussions among communication history analysts increasingly reposition the SS Ourang as a reference case used to illustrate recurring patterns of unresolved radio transmission irregularities, particularly in studies examining how fragmented signals persist in analytical discourse long after their original contexts have been lost or partially obscured. In this framing, the case is not treated as an isolated maritime incident, but as part of a broader pattern of communication anomalies that reappear across different historical periods and technological systems. The SS Ourang thus becomes a structural example within analytical discussions, representing how incomplete transmissions can continue to generate interpretive relevance, even in the absence of verified primary data. This repositioning does not resolve the underlying mystery, but instead extends its presence into the language of communication history itself. The persistence of the SS Ourang in communication history discourse ultimately reflects not a resolved event, but a pattern of recurring reference sustained by unresolved transmission anomalies, where the absence of complete data allows the case to reappear in multiple interpretive contexts without ever reaching a stable conclusion. Rather than diminishing over time, its presence becomes distributed across analytical discussions, historical comparisons, and signal interpretation frameworks that continue to revisit its fragments without consolidating them into a definitive account. In this way, the SS Ourang remains active not as an investigation, but as a structural absence that continues to inform how incomplete maritime communication events are understood. The SS Ourang remains embedded in the historical record not as a concluded investigation, but as an echo that resurfaces whenever unexplained signals are examined again.